and let's have a discussion on the topic on the situation in Crimea in the context of European security or maybe insecurity. So we all know that the illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014 has triggered ever-growing concerns regarding the security situation not only in Ukraine but also in Europe and beyond. Reports show that Crimea has become very much militarized over the last 6 years. And in this context, would like to have this discussion about the security situation in Crimea and how that could affect, already does affect, Europe in all, right? And also Ukraine, of course. And also, let's highlight today some aspect that maybe Sweden or European Union can do to help resolve this situation. So, if you follow the news, you probably saw that on the 9th of December 2019, the General Assembly of the United Nations adopted a resolution urging Russian Federation to withdraw its armed forces from Crimea, expressing grave concerns about growing military presence. And of course, Ukrainian state officials emphasized that, well, it's not just military presence, but also it is a growing military presence and actually nuclearization of Crimea. So the Russian Federation has transferred nuclear-capable aircraft to Crimea, so additional concerns, of course, arise in connection to this. And that, of course, poses very serious challenges to the existing non-proliferation regime, but also many more challenges. And I would like to ask you first, each of you, maybe in 3 to 5 minutes, address the most grave concern, or maybe the most important concerns from your opinion, when it comes to security situation and the importance of Crimea in this context.
Well, maybe I would start and just to, as an entry, with a very simple argument about why it makes sense that we are sitting here on the one hand, and why it is absurd that we are sitting here. And that is the Russian narrative that justifies the blatancy of the violation of the international law and the application of raw hard power for the annexation of Crimea. And the main argument that Russia has here is about the allegedly deep and ancient connection that Russia has allegedly with Crimea. And because of this ancient and so deep connection, there is, what was, so to say, no other way for Russia to behave than it could. But than it did. But just, and that is an information that you can actually find on Wikipedia, just to think about what we are talking about. There are still today in Crimea and in Ukraine people alive who from their childhood remember a Crimea when ethnic Russians on Crimea were not yet an absolute majority. Ethnic Russians became an absolute majority on Crimea only in 1944 as a result of the deportation, the murderous deportation of Crimean Tatars from Crimea, a decision made by Stalin. That is also why I think Russia today is rather unpopular among most Crimean Tatars, because he's going through a rehabilitation. And so in the early 1940s, there were children that today are still alive, some of them, and these children in the early 1940s, they in turn some of them would have grandparents who would have been children when ethnic Russians were not even a relative majority on Crimea. Because ethnic Russians became a relative majority, a plurality, you could also say, on Crimea only around 1900. Until about 1900, the largest relatively largest group on Crimea were Crimean Tatars. And then their numbers were reduced because of Tsarist anti-Tatar policies and Soviet anti-Tatar policies till then culminating in the deportation of 1944. So this entire discourse about the allegedly deep ethnic Russian connection to Crimea is actually a fiction. It's a mythology. It simply contradicts demography that you can find on Wikipedia. And if I still have a second, I would actually extend that a little bit. You know perhaps that the many arguments about the illegality of the annexation of Crimea, and usually the reference points are here the UN Charter, the Helsinki Declaration, the Charter of Paris, the Budapest Memorandum, but the most blatant violations are actually treaties signed between Russia and Ukraine, the Russian nation state, and Ukraine, namely the 1991 Belovesh Agreement, which is a fully ratified agreement ratified by the parliaments of Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine, which dissolved the Soviet Union, and in this agreement of December 1991, the borders were defined. And maybe an even more, in legal terms, important agreement is the 2003 border agreement between Ukraine and Russia, which is also a fully ratified bilateral agreement between Ukraine and Russia, and the ratification law for which was signed by nobody else than Vladimir Putin, who was president already in 2003, or 2003 when this treaty was ratified. So I think these are just, and I have a longer list here. Maybe I can come back to this here to illustrate why I think it makes sense actually to have an event here like that, and why I think this annexation is really a temporary phenomenon. It is something that has very little historical justification. It's fundamentally illegal, and if I may get later the opportunity, I also want to maybe talk a little bit about sociology and economics.
Thank you, Andreas, for highlighting the importance of what has happened to the security situation in terms of international relations and international law, right? So that is, of course, that has the consequences, quite direct ones. So now we probably will ask the same question, Oleg. We will ask him to highlight the top 3 maybe concerns when it comes to security situation. And for that, we'll need to improvise and to invite a random person from an audience to serve as an interpreter, since we don't have any left. So yes, please. So yes, 3 main top concerns, security concerns when it comes to Europe.
Насчет 3 я не знаю, но одна главная есть.
Yeah, I don't know about 3, but there is at least one.
В спорных территориях, на которые может предъявить одна страна другой претензий, очень много в Европе.
And there are many such situations where there is a dispute regarding territories in Europe.
Если вы загрузитесь такое видео в интернете, Европа за 1000 лет, вы увидите, как менялись границы много раз.
There is a video in the internet how Europe changed over 1000 years, and the territories have changed many times.
Но после 1945 года, после победы над последним мировым крупным диктатором Гитлером, границы устоялись, и все с этим согласились.
And after 1945, when the Second World War was finished, the territories have stayed the same.
В 90-е годы распалось 2 социалистические страны, Югославия и Советский Союз, которые Советский Союз более мирный, Югославия с войной, но распались по границам тоже своих территорий.
In 90s, two socialist countries were collapsed, Yugoslavia and Soviet Union, but after that, the countries remained with the territories that kept after that.
И вот в 2014 году Путин, воспользовавшись тем, что в Украине произошла смена власти после революции, захватил Крым и присоединил к себе.
And then in 2014, Putin just used the situation and annexed the Crimea
И если все мировое сообщество с этим согласится, в итоге с этой ситуацией замирится и не будет бороться до конца до восстановления статуса кво, это дает прецедент мировой.
If the world agrees with this, then this is a very dangerous precedent.
На котором могут ссылаться все те силы, которые захотят пересмотреть исторические границы и, ссылаясь на какие-то исторические области, присоединять либо захватывать новые территории.
Then new actors could just refer to it whenever there is a new opportunity to change the territory borders.
Это проблема, которая может коснуться практически любой страны Европы, в любое время.
Any country in Europe can actually encounter this problem.
Кроме этой бомбы, которая закладывается на будущее, есть реальная существующая угроза сейчас по фамилии Владимир Путин.
Apart from this bomb for the future, there is a big danger with the surname Vladimir Putin.
Потому что его задача не только в оккупации Крыма или захвата Донбасса, не только задача в оккупации Крыма или захвата Донбасса.
The point is not only just to occupy the Crimea or Donbass.
Он хочет контролировать эту арену, которую считает своей, это пространство бывших советских республик.
He wants to control all the territory of former Soviet republics.
Влиять на европейскую политику и на мировую.
And by this influence on the European and world politics.
Он ведет войну в Сирии, он поддерживает одну сторону ливийского режима и ведет его наемники присутствуют в Центральноафриканской республике.
He is having a war in Syria and supports the government in Libya, and his armed forces are also in the Central African Republic.
Это касаемо военных операций, но Путин у нас специалист по гибридной войне, по такому ФСБшному стилю, более тайному.
So this is just the army operations, but then Putin also has hybrid wars, and this is something from his arsenal of his KGB past.
Во многих странах Европы, включая даже такие группы, как Францию, Германию, Испанию, он поддерживает ультранациональные, ультраправорадикальные, либо сепаратистские силы, как в Каталонии, целью которых является дестабилизация этой страны и Европейского Союза в целом.
So in several countries such as France, Germany and Spain, he supports ultra-radical forces, right-wing and separatist movements that want to destabilize the situation in the country.
Влияние России очень сильно и в странах Восточной Европы, например, такие как Чехия или Словакия, там их присутствие очень сильное. Венгрия.
Putin's influence is very strong in Eastern Europe, in countries such as the Czech Republic, Slovakia and Hungary. His influence is very strong there.
Потому что амбиции Путина простираются намного дальше, чем границы России или границы Украины. Он хочет быть мировым игроком, с которым считается, которого все слушаются к нему, прислушиваются к его мнению и делают так, как он хочет.
So his ambitions are far beyond Ukraine and Belarus. He wants to be a world player that everyone listens to.
Его не волнует благосостояние своего народа, его не волнует мировая безопасность, его волнуют глобальные проблемы, связанные с климатом, связанные с правами человека. Нет, у него есть только амбиции, это флажочки на карте, которые он втыкает, где он влияет, что он захватил.
He doesn't really care about human rights and security and climate and problems like that. He just wants to put pin in different countries on the map of the world to see where he influences.
Поэтому этот человек – это большая проблема и большая угроза не только для Украины и России, но и для Европы тоже.
So this man is a very big problem, not only for Ukraine, but for Europe as well.
Thank you, Oleg. And now to you, Michael. Against this backdrop, what security challenges that annexation of Crimea has for Sweden, if you may?
Thank you so much, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's an honor to be here. Let me start with the one flank syndrome, because from a Swedish perspective, and maybe I should start by stating that what started with Crimea was, as you all know, a wake-up call in the whole of Europe, and a wake-up call certainly in the Swedish Armed Forces. And in the whole debate with regard to Swedish defense politics and security politics, which was pretty much dormant for quite a number of years. And as you all know, we were heavily committed in international crisis management and stabilization activities. For obvious reasons, I have nothing against that. But the problem was that we looked a little bit too far away from our own neighborhood, and that is still challenging us. So after the alarm bell went off finally, and we didn't manage to find the snooze button, we, as you all know, started to change our perspectives on security completely. And in a kind of a back to the future type of scenario, meaning that not only going back to what we once had during the Cold War, but also taking new challenges and new threats into consideration based on what we learned, both from Crimea, obviously, but also what we have seen in Donbass, as well as in Syria and otherwise. The one flank syndrome, just to come back to that, indicates that, well, we now live with a perception that our challenge, the challenge from the same actor ranges from the Arctic region over the Baltic Sea, over the Central European plains, down to the Black Sea, into the Eastern Mediterranean, to the Middle East, and now also into Northern Africa and even Central Africa, if you wish. Basically the same actor, meaning Russia, that we have to deal with in a multi-domain fashion. And I'm not trying to torture you with military mumbo-jumbo, but multi-domain means land, sea, and air is the obvious traditional domains, but we also have to look into the cyber domain, as well as the space domain. And as we all know, Russia is an actor in all 5 domains, and keeps on challenging us in that regard. So security has broadened, or security challenges has broadened in that regard. The non-linear approach, approaching us in all domains along this one single flank, is quite a challenge, not only to the military, but to the society as a whole. And it challenges our legal systems, how societies are constructed, and how we approach and delineate responsibilities within our societies. So I would say that this is I basically hate to use the word shift of a paradigm, but I guess I had to do that in this regard, because it is really a shift of paradigm, and it challenges our country and quite obviously a number of countries in Europe in that sense. So to sum it up, yes, this has set off quite a substantial challenge to European and global security, and it has also been a game changer in the sense how we need to construct resilience and approach security in a more holistic way. Thank you.
Thank you. And now to Alina, what challenges for European security can you identify?
Thank you, Karina, for your question, and hello everyone. And I'm very grateful that you came, and it definitely demonstrates that the topic we're discussing today is of high importance, even higher than the other issues that they're facing at the same time. As for the concerns in relation to the European security, I will develop the statements of the previous speakers, because I think that the highest concern is the escalation of the conflict by Russia and in Russia. And from this perspective, it is clear that the situation with Crimea, the annexation of it, became possible at the moment when Putin had a decrease in the electorate support, and it was a very bright buy for him to take and clearly to promote himself. This worked for a while, and it was quite successful for him. However, we know by some data that is made by Levada Center and others in Russia that his support is still going down. This means that he will need more actions to produce in order to stay alive as the person who is being legitimized by the majority of population and the population that is afraid to protest and so on. Therefore, I am concerned that there could be further escalation of the conflict in the neighbor countries, and we are not only speaking about Ukraine, but it could be also the Baltic countries, it could be also Georgia and Belarus. And clearly with Baltic countries it is a little bit safer because they are secured by the NATO. With Ukraine it is not that easy for Putin because yes, he will continue the escalation, but it is clear he couldn't provide as much blitzkrieg as he wanted, and the support of their of Donbass, of sponsoring Donbass and Crimea is also falling down among the population of Russia, and this is one first reason that he could create some other opportunities in his very creative way of dealing in the geopolitical way. And therefore Belarus and Georgia might be the next countries that we should think about and make as much possible the preparations for such possible conditions to be developed. And the second concern is the conflicts in Russia, because with the very recent events that has happened yesterday with Putin making him more or less possible to become a Tsar permanently on this position, it also demonstrates that the protest potential that is present in Russia will escalate one moment, and therefore it will be oppressed clearly by the governmental institutions. This could lead to the civil war, and I'm very concerned on the further preparation that could be done in this case, because clearly we are all afraid of the refugee crisis, and Ukraine could be the nearest country that could host the majority of the refugees, and it couldn't do it without the international support and so on. So these are clearly, it looks all like a very dark fiction, and I hope it stays like this, but I think we should consider threats by Kremlin very seriously.
Thank you to the panelists. Thank you for the contributions. So we've been highlighting some of the challenges that Europe broadly faces in the light of annexation of Crimea. And in connection to that, I wanted to ask you about your opinion about the measures or the actions that have been taken in response to the occupation. Do you find these measures sufficient, or do you think that other measures should have been taken? Can we learn something from the mistakes, if we have made any? What could have been done differently, and what should we consider for the future?
I think what concerning the annexation of Crimea, the sanctions that have been imposed were perhaps the only thing that the West could have undertaken. Maybe the sanctions should be harsher, and maybe much harsher, concerning Crimea's annexation. But I still think that, unfortunately, this is all limited to these sort of economic instruments one can apply here, which leads me actually to come back again to the security issue, and maybe expanding on that, on what something that Oleg already says, that the security implications are not only here, as Alina and Oleg said, within Russia or around Russia, as General Claesson said and Alina said, and the security implications are not even just about borders in Europe, but the the implications are, as Oleg mentioned, are even larger, and that is because the two parties involved in the annexation of Crimea, Ukraine and Russia, are both signatories of one of the most important treaties that humanity perhaps has, the so-called Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is about the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. And the problem, as you may know, with this treaty is that it is an asymmetrical treaty, and that Ukraine has signed this treaty as a non-nuclear weapon state, whereas Russia has taken over the status from the Soviet Union as being a signatory of the Non-Proliferation Treaty as a nuclear weapons state. And of course, the fact that Ukraine behaved the way it did behave in 2014 has a lot to do with the fact that Ukraine has no nuclear weapons, and also, what is often forgotten, the way that Russia behaved in 2014 vis-à-vis Ukraine and also vis-à-vis the West, and also the way the West behaved towards Russia in reaction. And now I come back to what should the West should have done, has a lot to do with the fact that Russia is a nuclear weapons state, and that the West did not react to the annexation of Crimea, how it, for instance, reacted to Iraq's annexation of Kuwait, or how it reacted in Yugoslavia, or how it reacted in Libya. That has, of course, a lot to do with the fact that Russia is a nuclear weapons state. And the odd thing about this whole thing is that Russia can be a nuclear weapons state according to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, whereas Ukraine is forbidden to be a nuclear weapons state according to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, because Ukraine has the same status as most of the signatories of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, except the P5, Russia, the US, Great Britain, France, and China. And this, and so to say, the fulfillment of the Non-Proliferation Treaty became, I would say, crucial condition for the annexation of Crimea, and the conclusion that not only other politicians in Europe, but across the world may draw from that if you want to have security for your country, if you want to have integrity of your territory, if you want to have political sovereignty, and if you want to secure your borders, what you need is the bomb. Or you need a friend with a bomb who is ready to employ the bomb for you in an arrangement like NATO, or in a bilateral security treaty, like, for instance, South Korea has with the US. So the implications are actually quite far-reaching, and they go way beyond Europe. They are actually about the whole world, because it means actually that the Non-Proliferation Treaty has become an instrument for an official nuclear weapons state under the non-proliferation regime to extend its territory at the expense of an official non-nuclear weapons state, who moreover was once, in the early 1990s, the third largest nuclear power of the world, which had more nuclear warheads than France, Britain and China taken together, and then agreed to, in the famous Budapest Memorandum, to give away these weapons oddly to Russia, and then become a non-nuclear weapons state. So this is actually quite a large implication. That is also why I think the sanctions, and I'll come back to that, will remain. And they will not remain because people around the world care about Crimea, or they care about Russia or Ukraine, or it has something to do with basically with the national interest of, you could argue, virtually every country in the world to keep the non-proliferation, the logic of the non-proliferation regime ahead, and at least, if you cannot, like in the case of Kuwait, return the annexed territory to its legal status, to at least punish the country that has violated the logic of the non-proliferation regime, because that is in everybody's interest and has actually very little to do with Crimea itself.
Thank you. And now I have a question question to Michael, to you. Do you think, or do you find the response, the international response to the annexation of Crimea sufficient? What could have been done differently?
The short version is no. I don't think that the response was very firm or clear. It was basically, as I see it, until the downing of the MH17 that we had to wait for some clarity in terms of the response. We have seen a kind of a slow response in the increase of, say, defense spending and defense posturing in Europe. However, I dare to say that the main thrust in that regard has been carried out by the Americans, interestingly enough, as always. And there's a lot of criticism to the Americans in their way right now, but in our relationship with the US, I can only confirm that they are actually standing up to what they have promised, which is not always the case with the European partners, I dare to say. I think that we have, if I may add on to that comment, we have sort of lost the sense of urgency in Europe. And that goes also for my own country. I think that we are now talking about increased defense spending and in a way that takes us far into the future, and that is absolutely correct and absolutely necessary. However, the sense of urgency that we also have to act here and now to increase the level of freedom of action through different posturing and investments, that has sort of gone away in the debate, and I do not like that. I would like just to conclude by saying that what is the major lesson identified from my perspective, and being a military strategist and not a politician, I still have to say that, well, this fine network or non-existing network between organizations like NATO and EU, regardless of how many nuclear states are in NATO, the exploitable fact that decision-making through consensus has its deficits. And I think we have seen that through the process with Ukraine and Crimea, that the exploitable lack of clarity and exploitable sensitivities in that regard is one of the biggest vulnerabilities we have to deal with in the European setting. Thank you.
Can I just ask one clarifying question? Do you imply any new settings in arranging decision-making at the European level, maybe?
Well, what I would first seek, because I was in my initial intervention speaking about the how the whole of society is being affected by non-linear warfare, and I would like to call for more cooperation between EU and NATO for obvious reasons, because this based on existing political inconsistency, if I may use that term, is the very fact that is being exploited. Because the European Union is in possession of some of the toolbox, or parts of the toolbox, whereas NATO is in possession of the other one. So keeping this delineation as wide as possible prevents us from acting unilaterally between the organizations.
Thank you. And now to Alina, what international response did we lack, we didn't see, when we should have seen that?
I think that there were, so first of all, we had certainly pressure and through the sanctions and the legislation procedures, that was important part of the question. There were the things that could have been done differently by Ukraine, and those are the clear policy on the integration of the Crimean Tatars before the annexation. We had lack of that, and secondly, there was also we didn't have the proper army at that moment, so all this make the state very weak in terms of response to the aggression. But this has changed through these years, and I can say, of course, that there has appeared there very proper discourse on Ukrainian Crimea, which reflects a lot their other minorities, ethnicities, and it is developing, and it is something very important that we got through these years. And secondly, the same with the army. Army became much more experienced and strong through these years, and also the civil society. It is much stronger, and it is very easy to be mobilized in the case of further need. So these are the things that could help not to happen what has been done, but we have the situation, and what we need more pressure on Russia in terms of sanctions, we need the support, and probably we need different programs to support US in Crimea and was in Russia in terms of understanding the human rights situation and developing the democratical view.
Thank you. So we highlighted already that Crimea has become very militarized. So can we do something at all to stop the creeping militarization of Crimea, and what that could be? And I would like to start with Michael this time.
I think for obvious reasons, taking any offensive action is ruled out. We all know what that would lead to, and I think the short version of an answer would be that keeping up the sense of urgency, and also keeping up the pressure, and not leaving the issue, and not to start looking for the reset button, which always is a very sequential and traditional Western linear approach to problem solving. That the reset button is too tempting after a certain amount of time, and I think we should try to apply a new behavior in that regard this time.
Andreas, do you want to add on stopping Russian militarization of Crimea?
Well, I do think we cannot do that much about that, but I think what these sort of events, I think there should be much more of them. And here maybe I want to bring in my own biography. I don't have a biographical connection to Crimea like Oleg, Alina or Abdurrashid, but I come from East Germany, and if you know contemporary Germany, you may notice something very odd, and that is that almost 30 years after reunification, the West Germans are still paying enormous amount to East Germany to keep East Germany running. We still have a special tax called Solidaritätszuschlag, Solidarity Edition, that is everybody paying in Germany, and which is a rather large, which then amounts to a rather large amount that every year for now 30 years goes to East Germany. And that is also my hope with Crimea, that and that is also my argument, that I would say why events like this make sense. Because in Germany, I don't know how it's here in Sweden, there's a fairly large amount, I would say, not just of the politicians and diplomats, but even of the experts who don't want to talk too much about Crimea, because Crimea is basically regarded as being gone, and is being we can talk about Donbass and maybe about Transnistria, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, things like that, but Crimea is sort of gone. Looking at East Germany, I don't think Crimea is gone, because Crimea is now very expensive for Russia. It's the largest in the Russian budget, by far largest, gets the by far largest subsidies. And judging from my experience from East Germany, it is going to stay extremely expensive for Russia, and Russia can subsidize Crimea as long as it has money, and as long as its economy is more or less doing okay, as long as it's stable. But my prediction would be that within the next 20 years, if not before, there will be a moment of destabilization, and there will be many people in Russia who are going to ask themselves, do we really need that Crimea? For the West Germans, concerning East Germany, this question does not stand really that much, because cities like Berlin, Magdeburg, Leipzig, Dresden, or my own home city, Jena, they are located in East Germany, but they are actually, if you like, the core of Germany. That is where the German nation was shaped, in these cities, rather than in the old West Germany. And there's no equivalent for that on Crimea. There is no Crimean Leipzig, or Crimean Dresden, or Crimean Berlin, or not even a Crimean Jena, which is a small city that used to be very important. Friedrich Schiller was there, and Hegel and Marx had his dissertation defended there. So there's no equivalent for that. And the whole, and there's some mythology, for instance, around Sevastopol, that allegedly Russian blood was spilled in the Crimean War in Sevastopol, or in the reconquering of Sevastopol from the Nazis. The problem with that is that there was no Russian army in the Crimean War, and there was no Russian army in World War II. It was the Tsarist army and the Red Army, and there was as much Ukrainian and from other nationalities of the old Tsarist and Soviet empires, as much blood from them spilled in these, or even more so, in these wars around Sevastopol, over Sevastopol. So there is no real deep connection, as I mentioned at the beginning, and I think this economic factor will at the end come in, and that's why I think actually Crimea is going to return, and not so much because it's going to be reconquered, or because there's going to be some sort of uprising in Crimea, but I think that in a destabilization and in an economic crisis in Russia, I think many people will ask themselves, do we really need this Crimea if it is so expensive? And I think it will remain very expensive for Russia, and that's why I think we should continue talking about Crimea.
Thank you very much for your reflections. At this point, I would like to open for your interventions from the audience. The time is running short, and we have, unfortunately, very little time left. So the next 10 minutes, let's pick up some questions. I propose we collect questions, and then we will let our guests answer these questions, please.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Stig Fredriksson. I'm a Swedish journalist and writer. Oleg, you said that we will never give up until we get Crimea back. One of the amendments that Putin has put forward to the Russian constitution is that it will be in the future unlawful for any Russian president to give away any inch of Russian territory. So Putin will not give back Crimea, but any Russian president in the future will not be able to give Crimea back because it will be against the Russian constitution.
Thank you. Let's begin.
My name is Göran Lennmarker, former member of parliament and also president of the CBEES. First of all, I just want to underline what Mr. Umland just said. I think that in the longer term, I think the economy of Russia will be the determining factor. Russia is a stagnating country. It will have problems with the East. Today, like Canada is to the United States, about one time to China. And if this goes on for 10 years, it will be 5-6% of China's economy. And to the west, you can see that a former part of the Soviet Empire, from Estonia to Bulgaria, are developing much faster than Russia per capita. Romania is now richer per capita than Russia. Russia has huge incomes from oil and gas. This is the challenge for the real problem is not Russia but Kremlin. I think we always talk about Russia. What happened 2014, in my view, is that Putin saw himself as perhaps a future Yanukovych. Be chased away from your country as a thief, the president thief of a country. So you had to do something. And what is really about to a great extent is to keeping Kremlin in power. And that is, of course, very difficult because you can never leave office. Because if you leave office, you risk ending up as Yanukovych. And people will start looking into what was stolen. you have been stolen. So I think this is in a way perpetuating the situation
Thank you for your comment.
for that. And another thing I want to add in connection with that is that the great risk that it hasn't been mentioned is that Russia is the most corrupt country in Europe, extremely corrupt. And that is also a threat that corruption creeps in, sometimes via Gazprom or via other ways. And that is really a challenge that we must observe. We see that through some Swedish banks, what's happening when money laundering, etc. But I just want to bring that into the threat of corruption also into our own society.
Thank you. And let's pick up the third question.
Yeah, I just reflect a bit on Umland's comparison with Eastern Germany. I would just ask, like, because for me, it's not really possible to compare these because as I understand German history, there was a lot of civil activism in Eastern Germany in the end. That was not, it wasn't as repressed maybe as in Crimea. So maybe when you said that you think that you want to see Crimea as Eastern Germany, and that's why Crimea isn't gone, then we also should maybe focus on the people there, like to really, how do we ensure that they make Crimea Ukrainian again?
Thank you. Maybe we have one more question from the other aisle. Yes, please.
Katrina Zoria, Södertörn. I have a question for General Major Claesson. Is there any collaboration security-wise between the Swedish and Ukrainian militaries that you're at liberty to talk about?
Thank you very much for a short question. So now let's give our guests the opportunity to answer the questions. So can we get translation?
Во времена Майдана Янукович принимал различные законы, которые назвали диктаторскими для борьбы с протестующими.
During the times of Maidan, Yanukovych had some new laws that were had purpose to fight the protesters.
Они были приняты и просуществовали 1,5 месяца.
They were adopted and existed for 1.5 months.
За организацию массовых беспорядков давали 15 лет. За ношение средств защиты общественного места каску бронежилет давали 7 лет. За транспортировку под крышкой давали 5 лет. За езду в колоннах автомобилей более 5 штук давали 3 года тюрьмы по ихнему за этому закону.
So according to those laws, one was sentenced to 15 years for organization of a meeting, 7 years for carrying ammunition, and 5 years for carrying the wheels and so on. Quite tough. Types, yeah. Sorry.
For burning. И все эти незаконные законы, все понимают, что это ужасно, что диктаторские законы, и они были отменены сразу же после победы Майдана.
Everyone understood that these laws were a disaster, and they were stopped right away after the Maidan won.
Когда власть Путина закончится в России, эти законы, которые он принимает в Конституции, нужно будет принимать уже 2/3 голосов. Я понимаю, что при изменении это сложнее, но все это абсолютно незаконно ужасные вещи, которые будут рано или поздно отменены, в этом я не сомневаюсь, и этого я не боюсь. Это меньшая проблема. Большая проблема убрать Путина.
Yeah, so when Putin gets away from the power, of course it will be difficult to get rid of those laws, as you pointed out, that it would be unlawful to give away the territory, but Oleg is quite sure that this will happen eventually.
Они завтра примут Конституцию, по которой Путин должен жить вечно.
Tomorrow there will be changes in the constitution by which Putin should live forever.
Но это не будет работать.
But that will not work.
And now please, Andreas, can you address the two questions first?
Yeah, maybe about the constitution and the fixation of Crimea as a part of Russia in the Russian constitution. Well, I think there will be a reassessment of the whole rule of Putin at some point, and that will involve the annexation and the new constitution. And I think all of that will be revised. And these revisions of constitutions are not that difficult, and they are not. For instance, in Ukraine, we had two revisions of the constitution, and the main problem actually I think for Putin at the end of the day is not going to be 2014 but 1999, and that is the way he came to power or he gained popularity, and these are the famous Moscow bombings of September 1999. And I think, to me at least, there is overwhelming evidence that the way that Putin became popular then is by these alleged terrorist attacks by allegedly Chechen terrorists, were actually a secret operation by the FSB. And once the discussion about that starts, then I think everything basically that Putin did afterwards is going to be questioned, including the annexation, including the change of constitution. So I'm less concerned about that. The comparability here between East Germany and Crimea is here, of course, very limited. I mean, these are very. Putin himself has tried to make this argument. This is allegedly something. So to say, the annexation of East Germany by West Germany is comparable to the annexation of Crimea by Russia. I don't want to compare the political process here. What I wanted to say is merely that these annexations are extremely expensive, and people did not expect that when East Germany became a part of West Germany, that they would have to pay this extra tax for so long. Yeah, but they are ready to do that, because you cannot imagine a Germany without Berlin, Magdeburg, Dresden, Leipzig, and so on, because that is Germany. Yeah, that is the core, the flesh of Germany. You cannot. But Crimea is not. It's an imagined part of it's a fantasy. It's a bit like northern Italy, where Goethe wrote about northern Italy, how beautiful northern Italy, and Adenauer lived on Lake Como in Cadenabia and was ruling Germany from northern Italy, and then you would have some sort of, and you would then have the mythology that Germany should get northern Italy because Goethe wrote the way he wrote about northern Italy, and Adenauer once lived on Lake Como. So this is an imagined history, and so you need the political will and you need the economic means to actually implement such an enlargement of territory. And I don't think Russia will have either of that. They will not have the economic means to do that for decades, and they will not have the political will, because it's a fantasized history that the alleged, that Putin was telling this funny story about the so-called Prince Vladimir, who was baptized in the Middle Ages in Khersones on Crimea, forgetting to say, I mean, there's a debate of whether this actually happened, that this was not Prince Vladimir, but this was Prince Volodymyr, and that was not a Moscow prince. Moscow did not exist at this point, although there's now a monument for Prince Vladimir in Moscow. This was a Kiev Prince Vladimir, who allegedly was baptized in. So this is this is just pure fantasy, and so I think this is really a temporary phenomenon. I think at the end, and that's why I think these events make sense, this will end at some point, and and I think there was a big misunderstanding both by the Crimeans and by the Russians in Russia about what actually the economic implications will be. The Crimeans thought they would be living better, and the Russians thought, well, this is such a nice peninsula, let's just get it, and we will be richer because of that. But that will not be the story. Russia will be for decades, or as long as it's the annexation, will be poorer, and they know that. They already now discussed that. Why is that costing us so much? And also the Crimeans will at the end realize that they joined the wrong bloc. The Eurasian Economic Union is not as good as the European Union.
Thank you very much. And now let's give an opportunity to Michael to address the comments about cooperation between Sweden and Ukraine.
Thank you so much. And yes, we do cooperate with the Ukrainian military. The big challenge here, based on what I said in my remarks, is that as we are expanding our own armed forces, we are trying to maintain our commitment to support to other countries, including Ukraine. So in that regard, I have to admit that the support is quite humble. We are involved basically within the field of training and education under the umbrella of the Multinational Joint Commission, But we also have a bilateral dialogue, military to military, on a yearly basis, in which we look into different areas of cooperation, again, mainly with focus on education and training. We are currently looking into, for example, to expand our cooperation in the maritime domain. For obvious reasons, as Sevastopol was lost as a Ukrainian naval base, the situation for the Ukrainian Navy is quite challenging. So this is a field which we are looking into right now. To give you one last example, we have been, for example, involved in the training and education of so-called combat lifesavers, which is very down to earth and very much contributing to the real thing. Thank you.
Thank you for concise remarks. And the concluding remarks, Alina, please.
Yeah, there was a comment about their knowledge and the opinion of the population in Crimea, and I would like to address that very briefly, that it is quite difficult to understand their opinions of the population, because we are very limited in our knowledge. We are very limited in terms of entering Crimea and getting open, transparent, real information, because people are under the threat. They are not answering honestly, even if they are not loyal to the regime and so on. They might not express this. This is the first thing. The second thing is that the population is being changed artificially. I mean that a lot of military personnel is coming to Crimea, and this is very similar to the situation after the deportation of Crimean Tatars in 1944, with the change of the ethnic landscape. Therefore, it is quite unpredictable in terms of these opinions. And the final thing is that Russia is classifying all possible information on the situation there. I mean, there are reports that their ballistic missile is there, and I've got a lot of interviews with Crimean Tatars who have moved from Crimea since the annexation. Some of them are prohibited to get to Crimea. This is first thing. And second thing, that those who have this possibility, they say that a lot of military actions are happening there. A lot of equipment is coming through the bridge and are located at the peninsula, but we do not know the extent of this.
Thank you, everybody, for attending the panel. Thank you for your attention. Please join me in thanking the panel.